I've devoted a lot of time to the topic of dominant chords because they have such a prominent role in a chord progression. They're like a musical bridge, taking you from one place to the next. In this video, I'm focusing on the dominant 7 flat 9 chord, and specifically the diminished chord that lies within it. I've talked a little bit about the symmetry of the diminished scale, which is comprised of alternating whole steps and half steps. Using the notes of the scale, you can build a diminished chord on the first note and a different diminished chord on the second note. The chord built on the third note would be the same as on the first, and the chord built on the fourth note would be the same as on the second. The pattern holds true for the remaining 4 notes. So C, E flat, F sharp, and A diminished are identical, and it's the same thing for D flat, E, G, and B flat. Because 4 diminished chords share the same notes, there are only 3 unique diminished chords that can be constructed from the 12 available notes. Within each diminished chord, any of the notes could act as the root. Again, this is all because of the symmetry of the intervallic pattern. In the cheeseburger video, I talked about the fact that almost all chords fit into what I call one of the big 3 categories: major, dominant, or minor. On the one hand, a diminished chord could be seen as a variation on minor since it has a lowered third. In jazz, though, the diminished chord functions more often as a dominant chord, and here's why. Here we see the notes of a D-flat diminished chord. If I add a C to the bottom, we see the outline of a C dominant 7 chord with a flat 9. Now I'll put the flat 9 on the top and take away the C on the bottom. This is an E diminished chord. If I add an E flat to the bottom of that, it becomes an E flat dominant 7 flat 9. C7 and E flat 7 are different chords, and they're derived from 2 different keys, F and A flat. And yet, when we add flat 9s to the dominant chords, they wind up being almost the same because they contain the same diminished 7 chord from the 3rd up to the flat 9. And that's only 50% of the story. Taking the same notes and building a diminished chord on G, and then adding an F sharp to the bottom of that, creates an F sharp dominant 7 flat 9. Building the chord up from B flat and adding A to the bottom creates an A dominant 7 flat 9. Now I've shown the dominant chords enharmonically for clarity, and also as we'd normally spell them. These 4 dominant 7 flat 9 chords, which each contain the same diminished chord, are associated with the keys of F, A flat, B, and D. So now we have 4 dominant 7 chords associated with 4 disparate keys that are essentially the same except for the roots. And if we look at the scales, even that difference vanishes. The scale that's most often used on a dominant 7 flat 9 chord is a half-whole diminished, because that scale contains all the notes of the chord. Because the scale is symmetrical, alternating half steps and whole steps, starting on every 3rd note produces the same scale. So the roots of the 4 dominant chords, C, E flat, F sharp, and A, all generate the same half-whole diminished scale. Okay, now I know that on one level this seems like a complicated bit of theory, but on another level it actually simplifies things for the improviser. Unlike other chords and scales which are unique in every key, there are only 3 unique diminished chords and scales. Because each diminished chord is associated with 4 dominant chords, it can resolve to 4 different keys. If you get the diminished patterns in your ear and under your fingers and familiarize yourself with the 4 possible resolutions for each, well, that goes a long way towards developing 12-key fluency. And here's an exercise that'll help you do that. The exercise is based on a 2-bar pattern, 1 bar of the 5, a dominant 7 flat 9 chord, and 1 bar of the 1, a minor triad. It works as well with a 1 major triad, but I think it's easier to hear if you use minor. The rules are simple. Rhythmically, you're limited to quarter notes, half notes, and whole notes. Harmonically, you're limited to the chord tones, 4 of them on the 5 chord and 3 of them on the 1 chord. You can repeat notes and you can take rests as long as you stay inside these guidelines. I mentioned in a previous video that improvisers sometimes overlook the harmonic clarity and melodic interest that can come from simply playing chord tones. And it doesn't have to be all the chord tones. See if you can still hear the harmony implied from only 1 repeated note per chord. Now here's where the exercise gets interesting, resolving the same diminished chord to 3 other minor triads. The notes of the 5 chord don't change, but the notes of the 1 chord do. When you first make the shift, your ears are surprised, but the new tonality pretty quickly takes hold. Now, to give a more real-world application, I'm going to take this exercise and loosen up the rules somewhat, applying a more varied rhythmic approach and allowing a bit of scalar movement along with the arpeggios. All the basic elements of music are in play here: rhythm, harmony, and melody within the context of a single-note line. These examples used one of the 3 diminished chords and covered 4 of the 12 keys. The others work the same way. Now, if you're just in the process of learning how to improvise, it'll take some time and effort to be able to do what I did in the second example. But everybody should be able to do what I did in the first. To give yourself a worksheet, write out the notes of the 3 diminished chords in all 4 inversions. The bottom note of each chord represents the flat 9, so the root of the dominant chord is a half step below that. Add the notes of the 1 chord after each of the diminished chords. Once you have them all written out for yourself, it's pretty simple to memorize one pair at a time, so work on the exercise without looking at the page. It's a musical truism that when you take your eyes out of the equation, your ears come to the forefront. Now, you can slow down the tempo as much as you want, but use a metronome to stay in time and work with whole notes and half notes before you try quarter notes. You know, for those who have some jazz vocabulary under their belts already, this can actually be a challenge. If you take away the 8th note patterns that you have under your fingers, you'll find out just how clearly you're able to delineate harmonic form with your melody.